The lesser-known candidate is presented by the law firm of SSA Lawyers PA, a law firm representing the disabled in Social Security and VA compensation claims. If you need an attorney to assist you with a Social Security or VA compensation claim, call the law firm of SSA Lawyers PA at 1-800-875-8064 or send an email to info@ssalawyers.com. And now, back to the lesser-known candidate. David Bernstein met Rocky at Tampa International Airport on Sunday, April 29th. Rocky checked into the Grand Hyatt, which is located right before the Courtney Campbell Causeway, the road and bridge that connects Tampa to Clearwater. The next day, David and Rocky met for breakfast to discuss the campaign. David asked Rocky how he was doing with studying the issues. Rocky admitted that he had been so busy trying to raise money and make sure he got on the ballot that he hadn't had much time to study the issues. David suggested that Rocky take the 15 cabinet positions and learn about the most important issues facing each agency. Let's start with the Department of State. That's the agency that's in charge of foreign policy. The hot areas in the world are China, Ukraine, Russia, Iran, Israel, and North Korea. We also have to address Mexico and Central and South America, along with Cuba. I'm going to give you some briefing papers on these countries. It's also a good idea to memorize the names of the leaders of the major countries in the world, and for God's sake, don't pull a Gary Johnson and ask what is Aleppo. The next cabinet position is Treasury. Know the name of the Secretary of the Treasury Department. Know that the Treasury is responsible for printing money and making coins, that it is responsible for dispersing money to the American public for things such as Social Security and VA benefits. Know that the Treasury is responsible for printing money and making coins, that it is responsible for dispersing money to the American public for things such as Social Security and VA benefits, and that the Treasury also borrows money by selling Treasury bonds. The Treasury also helps implement economic sanctions against foreign threats. The IRS is under the Treasury Department. The next agency is the Department of Defense. This agency is in charge of our armed forces, Army, Navy, Marines, Air Force, Space Force, Coast Guard, and National Guard. You should know the names of the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. We'll talk about this later, but the defense budget is about $800 billion. That's a huge chunk of the discretionary budget. The total budget is $6.3 trillion. About $2 trillion is discretionary, so 40% of the discretionary budget is defense. For now, I want you to study up on state, treasury, and defense. How are you doing with the stump speech and social media? Asked David. Rocky again had to admit he hadn't put much thought into it. David suggested that Rocky think like a businessman and sell himself as he would sell cars. Rocky, let's say instead of trying to get people to vote for you, you were trying to sell cars and you wanted people to buy cars from you. What would you tell them? Asked David. Well, first I would want to build trust. I would want to make sure I have good reviews on Google, Yelp, social networks, etc. Secondly, I would want to be first on the search engine results page. I would target the right people for an ad campaign. I would try to create a sense of urgency to buy a car from me rather than the dealer down the street. For instance, I might say, this week only, buy any new Hyundai vehicle and get a free oil change for the first 2 years. Finally, the ads have to stand out and be different. Great, said David. Get with your ad people and put together an ad campaign for Rocky for president. You probably aren't going to be invited to a debate, but you might have to respond to some talk show host or TV reporter, so it wouldn't hurt to watch some presidential debates from previous elections. After breakfast, Rocky's head was swimming. There's no way I'm going to be able to remember all this stuff. It's a good thing I have no chance of winning. I just hope I make a respectable showing and pick up a few delegates and make my point. Rocky decided to take a few days off and spend some time in the Tampa Bay area. He had his wife Alana fly down on Tuesday. They spent a few days at the Don Cesar on St. Petersburg Beach, lying out by the pool, walking the beach, and checking out the Salvador Dali Museum, Fort DeSoto Park, and John's Pass Marina. When Miguel joined them on Friday, he and his father went deep-sea fishing, while Kathy and Mrs. Della Grande went to Tampa to check out the International Mall. Saturday's game was at 4:10 p.m. Adam had to be at batting practice by noon. The game on Sunday was at 1:40 p.m., so they decided to do the fundraiser at Tropicana Field in the Tropicana Room. Although Tampa Bay was home to the Rays, Tampa was also the home of Hal Steinbrenner's deceased father, George Steinbrenner, the previous owner of the Yankees, and the spring training site of the New York Yankees. When Tampa Bay Rays play the Yankees, there are usually almost as many Yankees fans as Rays fans. When word got out that Adam George would be available to meet with fans if they attended a political fundraiser for Rocky, the room was sold out. 50 fans shelled out $250 each to meet Adam George and take a picture with him. They didn't care whether Rocky was a Democrat, Republican, Libertarian, or Socialist. The next away game was in Toronto, which of course is in Canada. After that, the Yankees were scheduled to play in Cincinnati. Because Rocky could not raise money in Canada, and he already had enough donations in Ohio from his fundraiser in Cleveland, they could take a break from fundraising for a bit. Rocky and Miguel returned to Freehold, New Jersey. Rocky spent the next 10 days studying the responsibilities and duties of the Department of Agriculture, Justice, Interior, Labor, and Energy. He also began memorizing the names of all the U.S. senators and all committee chairs and minority leaders for each committee in the House and Senate. Miguel worked on Rocky's stump speech and advertising campaign, as well as lining up companies to collect signatures for ballot placement. Although the dates to collect signatures were months away, he would have only had a short window to get the signatures collected, so he had to make sure the timing was perfect and also that he had a backup plan in case a company couldn't or wouldn't do the job. Rocky, Miguel, and Kathy repeated the fundraising routine with Adam George in Seattle at the end of May, in Los Angeles and Boston the first 2 weeks in June. They had raised enough money in contributions from New York, New Jersey, Maryland, Ohio, Minnesota, Texas, Florida, Washington, California, and Massachusetts. 10 down and 10 to go. The next fundraiser was scheduled for St. Louis on July 1st, the last away game before the All-Star break. After the room and catering for St. Louis was arranged, Kathy got a call from Brian Greenberg. "Hey Kathy, just checking in," he said. "Any updates for me?" "Everything is great," she responded. "I'm getting to travel all over the country. The Della Grandes are really nice people. I really don't think the president has anything to worry about. They're really harmless." "I don't get it," he pondered out loud. "Why are they flying all over the country to do fundraisers?" "I thought you knew," Kathy answered. "To get matching funds, they have to raise $5,000 in 20 states in increments of no more than $250 per contributor. Once they do that, the government matches their contributions up to the maximum amount, provided they agree to a cap in contributions and expenditures." "I see," said Brian. "That makes sense now. Thanks for the heads up, Kathy. Looking forward to working with you in Washington." After he got off the phone with Kathy, Brian Greenberg thought to himself, "If Rocky qualifies for matching funds, that is going to be picked up by the media. The only reason he's getting contributions is because of Adam George. I have to find a way to stop this. I can't call Hal Steinbrenner personally, as that would connect the president. What I can do is telephone the chairman of the Democratic Party of Florida, advise him of what's going on, and that it would be in the best interest of the party if the Yankees asked Adam to stop doing these fundraisers during baseball season because he needed to focus on baseball." A week later, Rocky got a call from Adam George. Adam advised him that the general manager of the Yankees told him that he didn't want him to do these fundraisers with Rocky anymore. "I'm sorry, but I have to quit doing them. I wish you luck," said Adam. Rocky was heartbroken. He had put so much time and effort into this. He thought there would be no way to raise money without a celebrity helping him, and he didn't know any celebrities. He could pay someone to show up, but that would look bad. Rocky called David Bernstein and told him what transpired. David gave it some thought. "I have an idea," he said. "It doesn't have to be a sports celebrity. My daughter is a comedian in Los Angeles, and her good friend is comedian Vicky Gasser. It's a long shot, but let me see what I can do." David went on the internet to see what tour dates Vicky Gasser had. He saw she would be appearing in Las Vegas on July 1st. David made some calls, and Vicky, as a favor to David's daughter, agreed to attend a private reception for Rocky after her show. She even made Rocky's candidacy a bit in her act. After the show, 20 fans huddled into the green room where the comedians wait before going on stage, heard the shortest speech a candidate has ever given, and took pictures with Vicky Gasser. They were happy to pay the $250 for the opportunity to meet Vicky Gasser in person. Through various connections throughout July and early August, Rocky was able to get competitive eating champion Johnny Walnut to help him raise money after the St. Elmo's Steakhouse shrimp cocktail eating contest in Indianapolis, Indiana. He was even able to get the rap musician Ridiculous to do a fundraiser in Portland, Oregon before his show with Janice Washington. By August 1st, Kathy Martinez had returned to NYU. The campaign was struggling to obtain contributions, and without Adam George, it didn't look as if they were going to be able to meet the 20-state requirement to be eligible for matching funds before the filing deadlines to get on the presidential primary ballots. Several states had provisions for automatic placement if a candidate had qualified for federal matching funds, and in Rocky's view, it was very important to achieve this goal. The campaign had filed their quarterly report with the Federal Elections Commission in July, which showed contributions of $55,000 from individual contributors. Brian Greenberg, the president's chief political consultant, was confident that Rocky would not be able to collect enough contributions in enough states to qualify for matching funds with Adam George out of the way. Donald McAdams, the chair of the Republican National Committee, had been looking at the Federal Elections Commission filings also. He primarily had been looking at filings from the Republican candidates, but Rocky's contributions caught his eye. He thought to himself that if a Democrat ran against the president and got enough votes to get some delegates, this would show the public that the president did not even have complete support from his own party. He didn't think Rocky could generate enough buzz, at least without any help, but with a little aid from him, maybe he could pull it off. Donald McAdams concocted a scheme to help Rocky without Rocky knowing who was behind the help. Donald McAdams was acquainted with Lisa Cohen, an activist with the American Israeli Political Affairs Committee, fundraising director of the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., and a frequent contributor to both Democratic and Republican political campaigns. Lisa Cohen was not particularly fond of President Anderson, especially since she saw him as not as close of an ally with Israel as the Republican contenders, and especially antagonistic to the current Prime Minister of Israel. Donald McAdams called Lisa Cohen and told him of his idea to help an unknown Democrat who was running against President Anderson. What if a group of pro-Israel activists asked Rocky to write a position paper on Israel, and after he writes the paper, contributors send him checks? We could ask Republican pro-Israel advocates to make contributions to him, and even some pro-Israel Democrats who do not like his position on Israel. Since you would be the one that is asking, there would be no trail back to the Republican Party. It would appear that he's getting contributions because of his stance on the issues pertaining to Israel. Rocky would have no clue. Lisa Cohen thought this was a great idea. Many of the Republican activists gave money to Democratic candidates in districts which were clearly Democratic-leaning, and the election pitted a pro-Israel Democrat versus an anti-Israel Democrat. So it would not be that unusual for these donors to give to a Democratic candidate that was pro-Israel. The American Israeli Political Affairs Committee had supported Democrat Valerie Forshee in North Carolina's 4th Congressional District and Democrat Haley Stevens in Michigan. Many Republican donors had given money to Democratic Congresswoman Elaine Luria in Virginia. Although she lost to the Republican challenger Jan Kiggins, contributions from the same donors to Rocky's campaign would not raise a red flag. To ensure that Rocky got financial support, Lisa Cohen took a leave of absence from her job at the Holocaust Museum. Lisa Cohen called David Bernstein, who also happened to be a member of the American Israeli Political Affairs Committee. He knew her from AIPAC conferences and was familiar with AIPAC requesting position papers from candidates and the fact that Republicans often contribute to Democratic candidates in Democratic primaries to ensure pro-Israel Democrats at least make it to the general election. Lisa Cohen told David that she would like for Rocky to do a position paper on Israel. David thought this would be a good idea and thanked Lisa for reaching out to him. David immediately called Rocky and advised him of the call. "This could be your break," he told Rocky. "If you write a good position paper on Israel, you might be able to get your donations from pro-Israel advocates." Neither David nor Rocky knew that they were being set up. David volunteered to write the position paper for Rocky. Within 24 hours, it was finished. David knew exactly what AIPAC wanted to hear. The paper was then submitted to Lisa Cohen. A week later, David received a call from Lisa Cohen. She told David that she read the position paper and was so impressed with Rocky, she was taking a leave of absence from her position at the Holocaust Museum to volunteer for the campaign. David was excited to hear this. He made arrangements for her to meet with Miguel. Shortly thereafter, Lisa Cohen was appointed Deputy Finance Director. Lisa Cohen discovered Rocky's plan to obtain federal matching funds. He only needed 7 more states to reach that goal. Each metropolitan area in the country had a community leader such as Lisa that helped AIPAC identify donors to make political contributions. Lisa contacted her Republican community leaders in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Arlington, Virginia, Charlotte, North Carolina, Detroit, Michigan, Atlanta, Georgia, St. Louis, Missouri, and Chicago, Illinois. She asked that the contributions be staggered and in varying increments to avoid the appearance that this was a coordinated effort. She also asked Republican community leaders in other states to have donors contribute money to further obfuscate her plan. Because the reporting for the period of July through September was not until October, Brian Greenberg would not find out that Rocky was going to qualify for matching funds until it was too late. Over the next few months, Rocky's campaign received over $50,000 from all over the country, and when the contributions were tallied up, Rocky had succeeded in receiving at least $5,000 from individual donors in amounts no greater than $250 each in 20 states, and by September 30th, he officially qualified for federal matching funds. Miguel was so happy with Lisa Cohen, he offered her a paid position with the campaign. Lisa Cohen called Donald McAdams to see what he thought she should do. The original idea was that she would only volunteer for 3 months to make sure Rocky raised enough money to give the president a hard time. She felt uncomfortable about working for a Democrat, even if he was running against the president. Donald McAdams asked Lisa to please stay on. He reminded her that if the Republican candidate won the general election, this would be in Israel's best interest, and by helping the Republicans, she was helping Israel. He asked her to just remain with Rocky's campaign until he withdrew his candidacy after losing every primary election. Lisa agreed. She called Miguel to advise him of the good news. She would accept the position. In October, the financial reports of the campaign were filed and made public. Brian Greenberg saw that Rocky had raised $115,500, excluding the $50,000 he lent to the campaign himself, and qualified for matching funds. Why are people donating money to him? He asked himself. They must know he doesn't have a chance. He started looking at the donor list and realized that many of the donors were Republicans with Jewish surnames. He surmised that someone from AIPAC must have been behind this, but he also knew that the president would be ill-advised to go after AIPAC. The last thing he needed was to be labeled as anti-Israel. Brian Greenberg felt he needed an insider to keep him informed about what Rocky's campaign was up to. He called Kathy Martinez and asked her if she would take a break from her studies at the end of the semester in December and work for Rocky's campaign. He advised that he would make it worth her while when she began working in the White House after the general election. Kathy reluctantly agreed. She genuinely liked Miguel de la Grande and felt guilty for betraying him by pretending to support his father. However, Miguel was not interested in her. She was not in his league, not even close. And she was ambitious. The job Brian Greenberg offered was more than she could hope for coming right out of college. Kathy called Miguel and asked if she could work for the campaign beginning in January if she took the semester off. Miguel immediately agreed. Unbeknownst to Kathy, Miguel had a crush on Kathy. He decided he would wait until the campaign was over and would then ask her out. Until then, he would keep the relationship platonic and strictly business. Although David Bernstein was consulting the campaign, he was not devoting a lot of time to Rocky. David was busy with his law practice and teaching his class on presidential primaries. In October, his lesson plan was for the 1860 election. David wrote on his notepad, "Up until 1856, the Democratic Party pretty much had a monopoly on national politics. The Whig Party was pretty much dissolved. There were minor parties here and there. Then an upstart party called the Republican Party was formed primarily by former Whigs and anti-slavery Democrats. To be clear, the Republicans by and large were not pro-black or abolitionists. For the most part, they were capitalists that believed that if slavery was not extended into the territories, slavery would go away on its own in a few decades due to economic reasons. The Republican candidate lost to James Buchanan in 1856, but did pick up a few states in the Electoral College. In 1860, the leading Republican candidate was William Seward, who was known for his stance against the spread of slavery. However, the Republicans at the National Convention did not believe Seward could win. After several ballots, Abraham Lincoln, a one-term congressman with a moderate stance on slavery, who supported tariffs and was pro-business, secured the nomination. On the Democratic side, Stephen Douglas was figured to be the nominee. Douglas had a problem, however, with Southern Democrats. Back in those days, the party rules required 2/3 vote to secure the nomination. Douglas could not achieve that threshold. As a result, the Democratic Party split into the Northern faction and Southern faction. Douglas represented the Northern Democrats, and John Breckinridge of Kentucky and the then current vice president represented the Southern Democrats. A third party called the Constitutional Union Party also ran a candidate, John Bell of Tennessee. Abraham Lincoln only received 39.8% of the vote nationally, but because the Democratic Party was split, Lincoln won the election. David thought to himself that today's political environment is not nearly as bad as the environment during the 1860 election. In every election, politicians say that the country is more divided than ever, and that this is the most important election in the lifetime of most voters, which of course is not true. David continued writing. In 1864, when Lincoln ran for re-election, he was not even sure he would get his own party's nomination again. For a while, the war had been going badly for the North. Many people in the North wanted the war to end and were okay with the South seceding. Fortunately for Lincoln, the North started picking up victories as the party's nomination convention was nearing. In addition, Lincoln had appointed some of his rivals in 1860 to cabinet positions, making it difficult for them to oppose Lincoln for the nomination. On the Democratic side, General George McClellan won the nomination. To ensure a balanced sectional ticket, Andrew Johnson, an war Democrat from Tennessee, was chosen as Lincoln's running mate. Lincoln easily won re-election. Retrospectively, Andrew Johnson was a horrible choice for vice president. As the next presidential election was approaching, David decided to skip ahead to some of the more recent presidential elections and primaries. If he had time, he would go back to the elections and primaries from 1868 until 1968. He wanted the students to understand what was happening during the current election cycle and how we got here. David noted that it was not until 1901 that a state had a presidential primary election. Until then, the delegates were party leaders and elected officials of the party. In 1912, there were only 14 states that held presidential primaries, and most were not binding. They were just to show preference. The year 1968 was a pivotal year in moving to the binding primary system. Incumbent President Lyndon Johnson was the presumptive nominee for the Democratic Party. When he won by a narrow margin in the New Hampshire primary against Eugene McCarthy, he decided not to run for re-election. Robert Kennedy then entered the race, followed by Vice President Hubert Humphrey. Humphrey avoided the primaries and collected delegates in states with caucuses and conventions. As everyone knows, Robert Kennedy was shot and killed on June 6, 1968, following a victory in the presidential primary in California. Humphrey received the nomination at the convention, although he did not compete in the primaries. Kennedy and McCarthy, and later McGovern, were anti-war candidates, while Humphrey reluctantly supported the war effort at the insistence of President Johnson. The 1968 convention was marked by anti-war protest and violence. However, for the purposes of his class, the convention was where the rules regarding delegate selection changed the way presidential candidates were nominated. At the convention, a commission was appointed, chaired by Senator George McGovern, to examine how delegates were selected. The commission reported that in most places in America, delegates who were selected by party leaders disregarded the will of the voters. After the commission reported back to the party, guidelines were adopted to require a delegate selection plan, which included ensuring women, minorities, and young persons were represented. After 1968, most state parties elected to have presidential primaries, where delegates were awarded to candidates based on the result of the election. A few states still had caucuses, but they were in the minority. The party did reserve some delegate positions for party leaders and elected officials. These positions later became known as superdelegates. The 1972 Democratic primary had many candidates, including Hubert Humphrey, George McGovern, George Wallace, Edwin Muskie, Eugene McCarthy, Henry Jackson, Shirley Chisholm, James Sanford, and John Lindsay. Hubert Humphrey actually received the most votes, followed by George McGovern and George Wallace, but as a result of the delegate selection plans, McGovern received the nomination. Many party leaders were upset at the way the delegates were selected, and they refused to support McGovern. McGovern got clobbered by Richard Nixon in the general election. However, the change in the primary system set up the election of a little-known Georgia governor and peanut farmer in the next election. After Watergate, the Republican brand was greatly tarnished. Gerald Ford, the first unelected president, was running for election on the Republican side. The Democrats fielded 17 viable candidates. Jimmy Carter campaigned hard in the Iowa caucuses and in the New Hampshire primary. He finished second in Iowa and first in New Hampshire, giving him momentum to carry other states and eventually win the nomination. At this point in time, presidential candidates realized the importance of doing better than expected or winning in Iowa or New Hampshire. Winning or showing well in early voting states gave voters in the later voting states confidence that the candidates could win in their state, and if they voted for him, they would not be throwing their vote away. It also resulted in more campaign funds coming in. Special interests wanted to back the winner in hopes of getting favorable treatment of their issues. In 1980, Carter's popularity was very low. Inflation was high, and he was perceived as handling the Iran crisis badly. In November 1979, Ted Kennedy announced he would challenge Carter for the nomination. Kennedy won enough delegates to force the nomination to be decided at the convention. To date, this is the last time a challenger to an incumbent won a statewide presidential primary contest. In the end, Carter lost to Ronald Reagan. In 1984, things got very interesting in the Democratic primary. Because delegates in most states were awarded proportionately, as long as the candidate got a threshold percentage of 15%, candidates who couldn't win might be able to get enough delegates to be a kingmaker at the convention and get support for their issues in exchange. Many Democrats in the South became Republicans by this time. In Louisiana, Mississippi, South Carolina, and Washington, D.C., there was a significant percentage of African Americans in the Democratic electorate. Gary Hart and Walter Mondale competed with Jesse Jackson for the nomination. Jackson won Louisiana, Mississippi, South Carolina, and Washington, D.C. He was awarded 358 delegates. In the end, Walter Mondale received 1,929 delegates, with Gary Hart getting 1,164, so even if all of Jackson's delegates all supported Hart, it would not have made a difference. But the possibility was there. Reagan beat Mondale by a landslide in 1984. The 1988 primary was even more complicated. Jesse Jackson had been awarded 1,023 delegates to Mike Dukakis' 1,792. Al Gore had 374 delegates, Paul Simon had 161 delegates, and Dick Gebhardt 137. Taking into account uncommitted delegates, no candidate had enough delegates going into the convention to win outright. Dukakis won the nomination, but then got beat badly by Bush. By the 1992 Democratic presidential primary, the Democrats had lost 3 elections in a row. President Bush's approval ratings were high, and major prospective Democratic candidates declined to run. The eventual candidates were Bill Clinton, Jerry Brown, Paul Saunders, Tom Harkin, and Bob Kerrey. In the Iowa caucus, Tom Harkin won his home state. Then Bill Clinton did surprisingly well in New Hampshire, raising his profile. He lost the next few primaries, but got enough votes to get delegates. He won Georgia, South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana. It was apparent the South liked the Southern governor of Arkansas. On Super Tuesday, Bill Clinton won Mississippi, Missouri, Oklahoma, Tennessee, and Texas. By then, he had so much momentum, it was smooth sailing all the way to the convention. Bill Clinton and Al Gore won the general election with a platform that sounded a lot like today's Republican platform. In 1996, Bill Clinton was running for re-election and did not have a major Democratic challenger. Nonetheless, he was not liked by all of the Democrats. This gave even a little-known candidate the chance to pick up some delegates and have a platform at the convention. In 1996, Lyndon LaRouche, a conspiracy theorist, qualified for a position on the Democratic Party ballot in a number of states. However, in January 1996, the Democratic National Committee chair sent a letter to the chairperson of all state Democratic Party organizations that LaRouche was not a bona fide Democrat, and should he receive enough votes to otherwise qualify for delegates, the state should not recognize the delegates pledged to him. Lyndon LaRouche actually received enough votes to qualify for delegates in Louisiana, Texas, Virginia, Arizona, and Washington, D.C. Each denied LaRouche delegates. LaRouche and his supporters filed a lawsuit challenging the denial of his delegates to be seated at the National Convention. The district court held that a party could determine with whom they wished to associate, with a caveat. The court stated that the right to associate under the First Amendment would not provide a defense to discriminatory practices based on race or national origin. Although Rocky DellaGrande was not a known candidate, his background and platform were consistent with the mainstream Democrats, and he was Hispanic. If the same thing happened to Rocky, he might have a better result from a court if he challenged the Democratic Party's refusal to seat delegates who would otherwise be awarded to him. The lesser-known candidate is presented by the law firm of SSA Lawyers PA, a law firm representing the disabled in Social Security and VA compensation claims. If you need an attorney to assist you with a Social Security or VA compensation claim, call the law firm of SSA Lawyers PA at 1-800-875-8064. Or send an email to info@ssalawyers.com. And now, back to the lesser-known candidate.